Professor of Communication at Seton Hall University. He got his PhD from the University of Maryland, his MA from Kansas State University, and his BSED from the University of Nebraska. You do get around. Scholarships. He has had several. One for Scrappers, How the Heartland Won World War II. I'll mention some other things as well. He's had one for You Boys and Girls Can Be the Minutemen of Today. And that is a narrative, possibility, and normative appeal in the U.S. Treasury's 1942 World War II comics. Is that correct? Missed part of that. And among other accomplishments, he's a Carl R. Wallace Memorial Award winner from the National Communication Association. He's a senior fellow at the Rockwell Center for American Visual Studies. He is a Gerald R. Miller Outstanding Dissertation Award from the National Communication Association, the Rose B. Johnson Southern Communication Journal Article Award, and the Distinguished Honor Graduate of the U.S. Chaplain Center and School. So, without further ado, I present.
Thank you, Dr. Schoenberg. So I'm going to begin with what will seem at first glance to be a redundant question. So this is the World War II Book Club of New Jersey. So how many folks here regularly read history? I figured pretty much most everyone, given the title of the group. Let me give a slightly different question then, or ask a slightly different question. How many of you frequently read fiction? Almost as many. That's good. So it will be no surprise to you to know that there is a genre out there that does its best to combine history and fiction, right? It's a growing genre of alternative history or counterfactual history. The academic version is practiced by such scholars as Niall Ferguson, but novelists have their fun with this sort of genre as well. And they ask interesting and provocative questions about history. For instance, what if Napoleon had actually prevailed at Waterloo? One question. What if the native tribes of the Americas, hadn't been susceptible to European diseases? What would our world look like today? Or what if Archduke Francis Ferdinand had suddenly had the desire to tie his shoe at just the right moment? How would our world look different? One example of this genre that you may have come across in the fiction world is Philip Roth's book, The Plot Against America. And in this book, Charles Lindbergh defeats FDR in the election of 1940. And the U.S. never goes to war, even as Nazi Germany goes on to be victorious across much of the rest of the world. And that idea is a recurring theme in a lot of the fiction in the 21st century. In literature, in movies, in TV shows. Here you see a still from The Man in the High Castle, which presupposes an Axis victory in World War II. And so there's lots of variations on that question. What if the Allies had lost the war? Typically in these versions of history, the Axis avoided critical military blunders that in real life they did not, or the Allies make military blunders that didn't actually happen in our time. And I think that for us, there's a certain comfort in experiencing these stories because we're reading about an event that we know how it came out. We all know the Axis didn't win World War II. We've had 70 plus years of remembering that lesson. And so it's easy for us to forget that if we go back in time to the shoes of those who were there in 1942, they didn't know how it was going to turn out. They had no idea. They might have had some level of confidence, but in 1942, it very much seemed like the Allies could lose. Think about some of the battles for a moment. At that point, in mid-1942, the only convincing U.S. victory was at Midway in the Pacific. Otherwise, American forces were either not in the field yet, or in the case it was the case at Bataan, had experienced historic losses. So that's why in August 1942, the Office of War Information Chief Elmer Davis, we can take a look at Davis here, didn't surprise too many people when he wrote this for public consumption. He said, "We could lose this war." And he didn't say that privately. He wrote that for public consumption. And the New York Times had a similar perspective in April 1942, using a sports metaphor. "It's early in the game, but already the home team is trailing by 2 touchdowns." So there was certainly not a level of confidence that the U.S. would win. Davis and the New York Times, as well as most people on the home front at that point, didn't know what we know in retrospect. The greatest generation really did think that there was a possibility that they could lose the war. Why? Why did they think that? Let's return to the words of Davis. In that same article, he had this to say: "The reason we could lose is because production, measured against military needs, is not enough for victory. The arsenal of democracy that we remember so fondly, so fervently, was producing a lot of munitions, but not enough to win." In 1941, the year before, Winston Churchill had put it most plainly. He said, "Modern war is waged with steel." But where was that steel going to come from? Tonight we're going to explore that very question. So the World War II Book Club, I'm sure you're well experienced in talking about the various battles of the war. Tonight the focus will be very much on the home front, which was very, very important in the prosecution of those battles. My clicker is coming apart here. There we go. So, like any academic treatment, we need a little bit of structure, if only for academics like me to argue over. So, here's the plan that I have in mind for the next 45 minutes or so. I want to begin by identifying the scrap emergency itself, because this is something that's largely been forgotten in our memories of the war. We've forgotten how dire it was in 1942, the middle of 1942. Then I want to take a look at our neighbors over in Pennsylvania, Coatesville, Pennsylvania, and show how they gave us some insight into how we could solve this emergency. Then we're going to go to the Midwest, where I grew up, in Norfolk, Nebraska, and see what the Cornhuskers had to say about the scrap emergency. And all of that led to what one participant called the greatest treasure hunt in history in the fall of 1942. And we'll have some time at the end to look back and have some discussions. So, are you ready?
Yes.
All right, let's do it. We'll begin with the scrap emergency. So one key reason for the stuttering war machine in mid-1942 was relatively simple. Scrap metal stores at steel factories were rapidly declining. And why were they declining? Well, the wartime atmosphere had overturned our peacetime system. So take a look at this diagram, if you would. Hopefully you can see some of the particularities there. For decades, the open hearth method of steelmaking was the default system in the United States. And that process, the way the very system had been built, required approximately 50% of recycled iron ore, recycled scrap that is, along with iron ore dug up from the ground. And so you can see at 2 different spots here to produce our ton of ingot steel, we have scrap entering into the equation. Approximately 1/2 of every steel product came from scrap. Interesting. Did anyone here know that before? I just said that. Okay. So that's the process for steel, and it is largely still the way the system is built. And in peacetime, this process is not a problem. It's a cyclical process, right? Your car begins to rust, you sell it to someone who eventually gets junked, it goes to the junkyard, it gets taken apart, it's shipped back to be melted down and turned into steel again, where it comes to life and goes through another series of its life cycle. But in 1940, when the defense program began to ramp up, the need for steel quickly outpaced that system. They got very far ahead of it. And steel factories began using their reserve supplies of scrap, and soon the shortages were alarming. By mid-1942, there was a crisis of the highest order. I want to give you some testimony so you can get a flavor for how alarmed people were. This is Robert Wolcott. He's the president of the Lukens Steel Company, located in Coatesville, so we'll return to his hometown in a little bit. He said, "The steel industry is going to end up the year of 1942 having produced 5 million tons less than our capacity." 5 million tons. And this, he said, can be laid to the inadequacy of the supply of scrap in the hands of steel mills. Think about that. 5 million tons of steel less than our capacity? That's a lot of munitions not being made. And when you're at war, that's a big issue. The situation was so dire that some steel factories were in fact shutting down. So 1 month after Pearl Harbor, Ohio Representative Michael Kerwin went on a tour of some steel factories in his district in the Youngstown area. And he wrote a private letter to FDR. This letter was not made public, but it has been preserved in the FDR library. He had this to say to the president: "When I made a personal tour of the steel mills over the holidays, I was amazed to find that in Youngstown alone, 9 open hearth furnaces, which manufacture 2,200 tons of steel each day, have been closed down. They're not operating due to the lack of scrap." You have to think that in the White House that raised a few concerns. And this was, in fact, an industry-wide problem. By June 1942, within the Republic Steel Corporation alone, scrap stores were so low that the company's production fell behind by 173,000 tons, which is enough steel to construct 3 Iowa-class battleships. Do you think we could have used those battleships? Probably. Here in New Jersey, people were aware of the problem as well. The Asbury Park Evening Press wrote a headline on January 8, 1942, that said, "The shortage looms in scrap metal." And it had this to say: "The lack of scrap metal is creating a serious problem in the war program, according to steelmakers." And it went on to note numerous factories across the U.S. that were already slowing down or had already shut down. Now, this all sounds like it's completely bad news, but there was some good news. Everyone knew the scrap was out there. They just had to look in their backyards, in their basements, in their farm lots, storage sheds, shut down defunct factories. Lots of scrap was out there. But the bad news was we had to convince everyone to go get it. This is hard labor, gathering scrap, and people have to be convinced of the need. And that's what the government tried to do in the first 8 months of 1942, and it was a failure. There were over 13,000 local scrap committees on the home front by that point, but they were a mess of red tape. You had to fill out forms to turn in your scrap. Nobody wanted to do that. By June, the trade union representative, Philip Murray, had this to say. He said, "The government's failure to gather scrap was almost criminal." Powerful words. But if we fast forward just a little bit to October 1942, so here's our light at the end of the tunnel, we see a national scrap metal drive that gathers 5 million tons. Wow. Where did that come from in only a few months? How did we motivate all those people to go out and grab that scrap? How did we get from point A to point B? Well, to answer that question, I want to offer 2 case studies tonight. The first is to look to the west at our folks, our neighbors over in Pennsylvania, specifically in Coatesville, Pennsylvania, which is the home of Lukens Steel in 1942. So you already met Lukens, who was the president of this operation. That's about 2 hours southwest of here. It's a factory city. It's basically everything revolves around the steel factory there. And in 1942, they have about 14,000 people, so it's a small town. Every year in the 1940s, going back to the Depression era, they had an annual cleanup week. Every summer, they would do this cleanup, and they would make the town all nice and spiffy. And they decided in 1942, because they knew with the steel factory right there in town how acute the need for scrap was, that they would harness this cleanup week in the service of scrap collection. Their focus was not just on metal, but other important needs: rags, paper, rubber. And from April 13 to April 18, 1942, they focused on mobilizing the community to gather all of that salvage. And it was successful. That city gathered 308 tons of scrap material. That's 42 pounds of scrap metal per person, and that was in only 6 days. So think about that, 42 pounds per person. This includes the infants, this includes the oldest residents, it includes every resident, an average of 42 pounds. It was a new record. How did they do it? They didn't just say, go gather scrap and trust that people would do it. They had to rely on intensive publicity. So the local press was actively involved in Coatesville. Go out, gather your scrap. It was a continuous campaign. We had widespread publicity across the town. You couldn't go anywhere in Coatesville and not be reminded. This was cleanup week. We need your scrap. We even had mobile publicity. This car would go up and down the streets, reminding people, you need to turn in your scrap. We had Boy Scouts would go from door to door, convincing the residents to turn in their scrap. And we also had a new innovation. We had a defined area where everybody could turn in their scrap. This was in the town square. And what makes this nice is not only is it a local central location, not only does everyone know where it is, but it's highly visible. I can drive past there and be proud of what my community has done, or I can be ashamed that I haven't contributed to it. We also had daily entertainment. So we brought in entertainers from the Philadelphia metro area. And every day we had a new scrap event. And to attend these events, you had to bring with you, as the price of admission, scrap material. So that's how they got to 42 pounds per person. So it was so successful that the Lukens Steel Company created a booklet. This is why we remember this, basically, because they thought they cared enough to publicize it. This booklet has been preserved at the Hagley Museum down in Delaware, and it's quite informative. It tells us quite a lot about their plans, and it even challenges other communities. It says, we've done our part to support our soldiers and sailors by making available all waste material. Have you? Well, at that point, the answer was probably no. Most communities in the U.S. had not done anything like this. If they had tried, they had largely failed. They simply weren't organized enough. And Coatesville's efforts generally seem to have fallen on a public that wasn't paying attention. It remained for another scrap drive in the summer, July and August of '42, to really capture the public's attention. And so that turns us to the third section, I guess. Anybody here ever been to Omaha? Probably not, a few of you. Right, so you've probably heard of the Henry Dorley Zoo. So that's one of the attractions of Omaha is the Henry Dorley Zoo. So when you say Henry Dorley in Nebraska, people think, oh, giraffes, elephants, right? But he was actually a real person. And he was one of the most important figures, I believe, in World War II that you have never heard of before tonight. And I want to explain why. First of all, let me introduce him to you, give you a little bit of background. So Dorley is born in 1879. That's the same year as Albert Einstein, Leon Trotsky, Margaret Sanger, Will Rogers. He's in good company. He was born on the island of Barbados in the Caribbean, so he was not an American. And that at the time was an English colony, so he was actually a subject of Queen Victoria, and he had an accent his entire life, so he kind of stuck out when he eventually landed in Omaha. In 1898, he immigrated to the United States. He worked for the Union Pacific Railroad, which is headquartered in Omaha, and eventually made his home in Omaha, where he met and courted a very important woman, Margaret Hitchcock, later Margaret Hitchcock Dorley. And it just so happened that she was the daughter not only of a U.S. senator, but also the publisher and owner of the largest newspaper in the city, the Omaha World-Herald. Also, her grandfather had been an early governor of Nebraska. So Henry managed to luck himself into a pretty influential and wealthy family. They were married in 1904, and ultimately, her husband found his way into the newspaper itself, worked his way up the ranks, and eventually would take over the newspaper. So just to give you a glimpse of his personality, just a little bit more about Dorley himself. In the 1920s, there were two newspapers in Omaha. There was the World-Herald, which he was the publisher of, and their hated rival, the Bee, the Omaha Bee. The competition between these two was fierce. To get ahead, Dorley began purchasing a market wire service, and so the World-Herald became the first, and for a while, the only newspaper in Omaha to carry the New York stock listings. Less than a week later, the Bee began carrying them as well. And it turns out the Bee was an afternoon paper, the World-Herald was a morning paper, and so Dorley was suspicious. He thought to himself, wait a second, we're paying all this money for these stock listings. The Bee comes out after us. I bet they're just copying it directly from our page and they're not paying for it. So he came up with a plan. He placed a fake listing in among all the other stock listings. He called it SBTB. And the Bee, in fact, printed all of the stock listings, including SBTB. And the World-Herald expose in the days after that exposed the theft, because SBTB stood for Stolen by the Bee. So that gives you a little insight into the creativeness, the creativity within his mind. So how does this man, this immigrant, this publisher in the Midwest, in a small town, get involved in the scrap mess? Well, on July 1st, 1942, he is on a trip to the train station in Omaha. He's taking his wife, Margaret, down to the train station because she's going to leave him for a while. And he's complaining. He's been reading in his newspaper all these stories about the dire scrap situation, and he's bemoaning this fact to his wife. And what do you think his wife said? She said, Henry, what have you done about it? And he took her seriously. He dropped her off, and he went home, and by later accounts, he stayed up until 1:30 in the morning thinking that very question. What can I, a publisher in the Midwest, really do about this problem? He decided that even though he probably couldn't have any influence in the White House, in fact, they had editorialized against Roosevelt since the 1930s, so FDR wouldn't probably answer any calls from Dorley. He could motivate the people of Nebraska, because they were the largest paper in the city, in the state, I should say, and if they succeeded there, they could get the attention of the other 47 states. And so he took his plan to the newspaper. We have our two couples there. Here we go. And he created what would become known as the greatest treasure hunt in history. It began locally and eventually went national. So let me offer you some descriptions. On July 2nd, 1942, Dorley called a mass meeting in the World-Herald building, and to the shock of his employees, he said, surprise, we, the newspaper, are going to sponsor a scrap drive. For 3 weeks, we are going to be the engine that makes this happen across this entire state. And here's our goal. Our goal is for every person in the state to collect over 100 pounds of scrap metal. That's an average. That's more than double what Coatesville had hit in its record. This was unheard of. The scrap officials in the state laughed at him. They scoffed at him. They said it simply wasn't possible. And he was undaunted. He clearly relied on Coatesville for some of his inspiration. So we have lots of local media involvement. Of course, he was the publisher, so he could make the paper do whatever he wanted. We had widespread publicity all across the city and ultimately across the state. This vehicle will look familiar. It's very similar to what Coatesville did, driving up and down the streets saying, turn in your scrap, over and over again. We had house-to-house canvassing, both Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts. We had a defined site in downtown Omaha, which became known as Scrap Mountain, and became a tourist attraction for a while in the summer of '42. The Saturday Evening Post called it the scrap pile that changed history in their feature on it. We had daily entertainment. Here was one of their scrap rallies featuring a pep band. And we started to have some new features. This feature was particularly important. This photograph appeared on the front cover, or the front page I should say, of the World Herald, and it features Mrs. J.J. Stewart, an Omaha housewife. And the headline, or the caption, said something like, Omaha's housewives are scrap ironing the Axis. And when you look at her posture, the way she is holding what I think is a muffler or a piece of an automobile, it looks like she's holding a weapon, right? So metaphorically, for these Nebraskans, and this was encouraged by all the newspapers in the state, the scrap that they gathered became munitions. They were encouraged to see a toaster that was no longer of any use as a potential piece of a plane. An old bumper that you didn't need anymore could become a machine gun. So that visualization was an important contribution to this. But the most important contribution was the level of competition. So I want to ask you to think about this here locally in New Jersey. What if we were to have this kind of competition in the midst of World War II, and Essex County issued a challenge to Morris County? Right? Maybe an editorial in the Millburn paper. We're going to beat that county hands down. They don't know how to gather scrap. We do. You think Morris County might respond? Absolutely. Absolutely. And in fact, that's what happened in Nebraska. Washington County, just north of Omaha, outright bragged, that it was going to be the winner. There's 93 counties in the state, so that's a pretty high claim to begin with. And immediately fell behind its neighbor, Burke County. The local headline had this to say, Burke County puts Washington to shame, because they had gathered 12 times as much scrap. So they didn't brag. They stopped bragging after the first few days. How do you assess that competition? Well, they had something for that too. We're going to publish our standings on the front page of every newspaper that will do it in the entire state. And it's going to be like baseball standings. We're going to update it every single day. We're going to have it's a per capita total, so it's divided by the population of the people in the county, so those folks in ranching country that don't have as many people can compete on the same basis, right? And if your county is in the lead, here we have Hooker County at an early point, has 26 pounds per person already. They can feel proud and maybe try harder. And if you're not on the list, you've gathered 0 so far, you're going to be ashamed and you're going to work harder. And so competition becomes a vital part of it. In fact, it becomes a sort of a horse race where the leaders are changing every day. The Norfolk Daily News wrote, down the home stretch come Nebraska's 93 counties today in a scrap metal collection race. Pretty exciting. By the end, with only 3 days left, the competition became even fiercer. Service groups would steal the cars of opposing service groups and turn them in for scrap. Counties accused other counties of doing midnight raids, and some of them actually happened into the opposing territory. So there's numerous editorials nationwide talking about what went on in the state in those last few days. At last, the results were in. Sparsely populated Grant County had collected some 637 pounds per person. That's a lot of scrap. Hooker County was right behind. You saw they were in the early lead. They had 541 pounds per person. Both counties were in ranching country, so they didn't have a lot of people, but they had railroad lines going through, so they had, I think, an advantage over the metropolitan area. But even Douglas County, where Omaha is, even though they weren't in the lead, they still averaged over 100 pounds. And the entire state did eventually got 103 pounds per person. So we had the awards for our counties, the gigantic piles all across the state. Now remember that Dorley's initial goal had been to show that the state could do it, and to use that as a sort of leverage to show the other states, hey, you can do this too. And so much like Coatesville, they published a book that bragged about what the people in that state had done and challenged the other states to do their part as well. And that booklet made its way to this man, Donald Nelson, who at that time was the head of the War Production Board in DC. And do you think he might have been interested in a successful plan to gather scrap? Absolutely, right? So he invited Dorley and his assistant to Washington, DC. He called a national meeting of publishers of major metropolitan newspapers, and they challenged them. They said, we want to do this across the country. It's not going to be county versus county anymore. It's going to be state versus state. Everyone's going to get involved in this competition. And this is where the phrase, the greatest treasure hunt in history, came into being as people were describing their experience in this national drive in September and October of 1942. So the competition was among the states, but there were also local competitions. You were allowed to make wagers and challenges. So one that was particularly notable was in Iowa, where Cass County and Montgomery County apparently had some bad blood going back for a couple of generations. And so they made a wager. The losing county's executive team would be obligated to sweep the streets of the opposing county seats downtown. And so that fall, the streets of Atlantic, Iowa, here's our state versus state, there we are. The streets of Atlantic, Iowa were a little bit cleaner after the opposing team owned up to their wager and showed up and swept in celebration. How did the states do? The winner was Kansas. Second place was the state of Washington, out on the Pacific coast. Third place was New Hampshire. So you see the amazing geographical diversity there. Everyone across the US was participating. Altogether, over 5 million tons of scrap material were gathered in only a few weeks. And that was a significant change from the failures of early 1942. And that scrap was in place across the winter of 42 and 43 and pivotal in increasing the American level of arms production. And of course, the timing was perfect because the US and the Allies were increasingly going on the offensive in late 1942. At the heart of it all were those patriotic, average, everyday Americans. People just like you and me, right? They loved their country, they saw a need, they were called to action, and they responded. It was in Coatesville, it was in Omaha, and it was in New Jersey too. Here is an ad that I collected from the Bernardsville News from that national drive, encouraging people to gather their scrap so that we could succeed against the Axis. So, looking back. I began tonight with the idea of alternative histories. We could have lost the war. The Allies might not have won. It wasn't written in stone. But these scrappers helped make a difference on one of the most important fronts of the war, the munitions front. Most of you, I think, are familiar with the old poem, "For want of a nail, the horseshoe was lost. For want of a horseshoe, the horse was lost. For want of the horse, the message was lost. For want of the message, the battle was lost. And for want of the battle, the war was lost." So tonight, you heard the real story about that horseshoe nail, those brave and patriotic Americans who gathered it, who found it, who sweated, who bled, and who cried over this effort here in the home front. So they are some unsung heroes that we often don't hear about when we think about World War II. But I personally believe that their efforts were indeed heroic and that they helped make a difference in the greatest war in history. And that was exactly 40 minutes. So, questions? Do you want me to call on people?
Yeah, go right ahead.
Okay.
How was it collected then from each of these communities?
Any way possible. So I interviewed a woman who at the time was, if I remember, 8 years old. And she and her friend went door to door, knocked on strangers' houses and said, "Do you have any extra scrap?" And somebody said, "Yes, we have this old safe in the basement." That, you know, they were older. And they said, "We can't lift it out. Can you do it?" And they looked at each other, and I think there was some sort of contest for the Girl Scouts or something that they wanted to get some credit for it. They said, "Sure, we can do it." And they managed, the two of them, these little girls, to get this safe up the stairs from the basement all the way across town to the scrap.
No, I meant the big pile in the center of town. How'd that get collected?
Okay. So once the safe got to the pile, most piles were located next to a railhead. And so those were usually equipped with the stuff, the cranes and such, to load them. Coatesville was not. That was right in the center of town. So I don't know if at that point they were really thinking about the next stage. On the other hand, Coatesville had the steel company right there, so it might have been that they had the equipment. But trains were a big means of transportation for the steel because all of the steel industry factories would have had rail lines going in. And so that was a way to get there. Okay. Yes?
What happened the next year? I mean, they took so much scrap out in 43 and 45 and 44. Did they have a problem meeting their quota?
In 42, they got the low-hanging fruit. The easiest stuff that they could find was found by the fall of 42. But the need continued, and so there continued to be drives throughout the war. But there were a couple of other factors that came into play. So one is that we were able to come to arrangements with some South American nations to bring some of their scrap and import it into the U.S. And so we used some of that. But also as the Allies began to win on the battlefield, that battle scrap became something that we could use and melt down. And so we got to reuse our own steel, if you will. You know, if a tank had been demolished, it got reused. Mm-hmm.
During these scrap wars, did you come across any interesting stories of, let's say, a neighbor stealing his neighbor's car and turning it in?
There's numerous stories like that. Let me shift it to a bit more general one. There's an anecdote about New York and New Jersey where the mayor of New York decided to place guards on the bridges from New Jersey to New York because New Yorkers were accusing New Jerseyans of going on midnight raids in favor of the contest. This is all the competition, right? Ultimately, it was all going to go to the same location, so they just wanted credit for it. And it may well have been that New Jerseyans maybe helped themselves a little bit to the New Yorkers' scrap. But yeah, lots of stories like that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and as I understand it, FDR knew we would have to mobilize, so he got together with Bernard Baruch, who did that kind of late. They didn't have time to mobilize in World War I. And he said, put Sorensen in charge. And he's the one that really, led that whole effort, building, planes and tanks and everything. And how does this reconcile with that?
Based on my research, the projects, there was a lot of uncertainty. I mean, part of it is just projecting into the future. How much steel will you need? And so, right after the U.S. goes, it's actually right before Pearl Harbor. So throughout 1941, you have a series of steel reports, and they're done by different individuals, projecting, if we go to war, how much will we need? But of course, no one really knows. And so Newsweek reported on one report that was optimistic. We'll have enough steel, and we'll even be able to keep our civilian production of steel products going. And FDR was elated over this news, because he was very fearful that all these civilian products were going to have to go away for the duration, which ultimately most of them did anyway. And then the very next report by the same person was more pessimistic. So by that point, the projections, had faced a downturn. So to answer your question more concretely, from the perspective of the steel industry, they were thoroughly unprepared. There were a couple of folks who had been through the World War I experience as steel industry executives who were still around advising, and they warned everybody. They warned the administration. They said, we've got to get steel in order, and they didn't do a very good job of it. Yeah. Yes?
I just wanted to interject that as a 9-year-old, I was the son of a very patriotic father who would run scrap drives in Newark. And one of the items that we were made to collect was the tin foil from chewing gum.
And you collect it in the big balls,
Yeah,
right?
right.
Yes.
So you see these immense piles of scrap metal, but those little tins.
In the end, even the smallest contributions were valued. Even if my pile of tinfoil may not ultimately have weighed that much, and wouldn't have made a grenade probably. Even the youngest folks were made to feel like they were contributing. And I think that was valuable, and I talk about this in the book Prairie Forge, for a different reason. It wasn't valuable just for the metal content, it was valuable for the esprit de corps. Making everyone feel like they were participating. I'm contributing to this. And think back to the housewife holding that metal part like it was a weapon. That's an expression of that feeling. We here at home are part of this war effort. And that ownership was vital. Absolutely vital. So many hands. Yes?
Yes. That was universal amongst the Allies. I was raised in Roselle, New Jersey. I won't give the last name, but there was a kid next door who was my best friend. His first name was Fritz. And in the middle and late 30s, my father used to smoke Lucky Strike cigarettes. And I would throw them away in the basket. And then one day I caught Fritz coming back after school to the junk and taking out the tin foil. Get it? Mm-hmm. Fritz said, my father wants to send as many of these boys back to Germany for our victory.
The Axis was very aware.
Deutschland über alles.
Bonds, right? In fact, at a certain point during the war, Hitler decreed a death penalty for anyone who failed to recycle their scrap metal. They were so desperate for that. Yes?
Did anyone ever calculate, the total amount of scrap that was collected across the country, and also what the value of that was?
The value is a good question. So the amount was 5 million tons. That was just in that drive in that fall of 1942. As you can imagine, it's an imprecise figure, right? So someone could have exaggerated in this case, and they missed something being weighed here. So it's an estimate, more or less. As to its value, a lot of these folks simply donated their labor and left the metal there, when they could very easily have sold it to a junk dealer, gotten money for it, and it would still ultimately have contributed to the war. But a lot of them felt that it was their patriotic duty. Now, I'm trying to think of some of the figures that I saw, and I'm going to resist saying them because they're probably going to be awfully wrong. It's been a while since I looked at those figures. But there was a town in Nebraska, a Holdridge, that actually went into debt because they offered everyone money for turning in their scrap, and they had to borrow money from the local bank, and ended up, being in the hole. So it was valuable, absolutely. And in fact, many of these scrap piles had to be guarded overnight from people, who would probably go through and see what they could find.
Putting it in today's perspective, I mean, we've sold U.S. steel to countries today, and how, as are we in the same position?
It's an interesting question for me because my wife is an executive for Tata Steel, which is operated out of India, and they operate steel plants both across Europe as well as in the U.S. So she's grappling with that very issue as well. And does it, if the steel product comes out of Ohio but it's owned in a foreign market, is that an import? So that's part of what she deals with. She's a lawyer on a legal basis. But yeah, I think if we were to face a similar situation today for a variety of reasons, I don't know that I would have a lot of confidence in us. It might take us a while to get up to speed.
We saw it in China.
Yeah, so both industrially, but in terms of morale too, I think we're in a very different place than we were back in the 1940s.
I think that's why the STEM schools are so important. We
Right.
haven't been teaching science and math.
Yes.
So we did that during the 30s, so we had a lot of people who were very smart that could help them mobilize, plus we've never been as united as we were at that time.
Right.
That's right.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Patriot.
Was there a comparable drive for aluminum?
The aluminum drives actually began earlier, before Pearl Harbor. There was a big drive in, I want to say July or August 1941, and it was successful but also a failure. It was successful in the sense that they created these big piles, and then there was all this bureaucratic inertia, and the piles stayed there. And they stayed there. And people started to complain about these eyesores, these rat-infested piles of aluminum that they said was so important, and there it sits. They didn't understand how the process works. You can't just begin processing it right away. You have stores, right? And so they were using the community piles as stores of aluminum. And I think they learned from that lesson with the scrap metal non-aluminum drive, because they carted this stuff away pretty quickly. There were indeed aluminum drives. Yes. And
Do
then-
you know
then Dr.
anything
Lewis.
about the collection of paper? I remember reading magazines which weighed more than regular paper. And how that, I never knew though what they did with, or I don't remember what they did with the paper.
Someone may be able to comment on that better than me. I mean, I do know that there were lots of appeals to recycle paper. And so if you collect magazines like Dr. Lemaiza does, you'll notice that in about mid-42, suddenly all the magazines shrink in size. And a lot of that was due to the recycling, the dire need for the paper. But what they did with it, I guess I'm not absolutely certain. Does anyone know what the military need for the paper was? Maybe it was just that they were devoting that factory space to munitions, and so they weren't going to spend a lot of time making new paper.
Well, it was
I don't
wood
know.
pulp, so they can make wood products.
Wadding for ballistics.
And wadding, yeah, packing. Dr. Lemaiza?
Well, I want to testify, I was going to, before the lady brought up paper drives, and being a collector of books and magazines, they were very efficient, because there are many magazines that were published. It's hard to believe that like in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, magazines were published in the hundreds of thousands. And what they didn't get in World War I, they got in World War II, because many of these magazines don't even exist in one copy, so they got them all. I mean, during the war
They
drives.
were very efficient.
And you're referring to the pony editions of various, when they would ship Life, or not so much Life, but Newsweek, Time, New Yorker,
Post.
Post. They had tiny little pony editions that they would send to the to the troops, because they were obviously smaller. But they were very, very efficient, because they just, and it's a boon for collectors these days, because things are pre-war, but very, very rare, because they all went in the paper. God knows it. Comic books, early comic books, early baseball cards. They're very rare now, because people would just throw them away and give them to the paper drives. And you might have a comic book that today would be worth $20,000 and give it away, because they didn't know.
So many of these things are so rare. Yes.
We know somebody whose father, before the Second World War, bought those huge newspaper rolls there. Bought tremendous amount of it. And then when the war started, nobody could get paper. Nobody could get paper. It was all going to the government for something. And that's how you couldn't get anything.
It was an
I don't know
investment.
what they
right?
used it for, but I'm sure they, packing equipment, you know, boxes, who knows?
Yeah. And of course, the government had lots of publications that it would do, you know, military manuals and so on. So maybe the GPO used a lot of that. There's some questions over here? Yes?
The use of paper became very, very efficient and made fortunes. I know I was raised in lumber yards, okay? And the paper was used to make your wall boards, which are still used. You go by and watch a new house go up, you'll see that green or blue wall board. It's paper. It's not sheetrock. It's not concrete. It's paper. And that's modern production.
Okay.
So next time you look at a house or buy a house, think about it.
You're buying paper.
And how it goes up.
Okay.
I have a question.
Okay, one more question.
You were referring to Lucan steel. What about Bethlehem steel? Wasn't that a town at that time?
I believe so, yes.
Absolutely.
I haven't come across records from them. They probably have their own dedicated archive. So most of my research would be from the National Archives or Hagley, which is where the Lucans ended up at, or the FDR Library. So if there were people who wanted to follow up on this research and do like a social history of the scrap drives, going to these various steel companies would probably be very informative. But of that particular company, I didn't come across anything in my research. Dr. Schoenberg?
Thank you. Great.